Tonight, we're embarking on a journey that will fundamentally recalibrate your appreciation for the simple act of taking a hot shower. We are peeling back the elegant veneer of the Victorian age, a time often romanticized with images of corseted gowns and dapper gentlemen in top hats. However, beneath the polished surface and intricate fashions lay a reality of hygiene so profoundly different from our own. It borders on the unbelievable. Prepare yourself, because we are about to explore the unvarnished and often quite fragrant truth of what it meant to be clean or unclean in an era where appearances were everything, but sanitation was an afterthought. The world beneath those beautiful clothes was a far cry from the pristine image the Victorians projected, and it's a story that will make you grateful for every modern convenience you possess. As we delve into these peculiar histories, your engagement truly fuels the exploration. If these stories captivate you, a simple like or a subscribe goes a long way in supporting this channel's journey into the forgotten corners of the past. I find myself endlessly fascinated by the global community that gathers here. It's a source of constant wonder to imagine you all listening from various corners of the world at all hours of the day and night. Do drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. There's something truly magical about knowing these strange tales are weaving their way into the dreams of a worldwide audience, connecting us across time zones and cultures in our shared quest for a good night's sleep. Now is the moment to let the day's tensions dissolve. Find that perfectly molded spot in your bed, that place where comfort is absolute. Allow yourself to take a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the air fill your lungs, and then release it with a sigh. With each exhalation, let your physical form feel heavier, sinking with profound ease into the support beneath you. We are about to travel, not across space, but through time, to the heart of 1850's London. Savor this modern comfort, this clean and quiet space, because the world we are about to enter is anything but. By the time our story concludes, you will have a newfound reverence for the simple, unblemished mattress you're resting upon. Your consciousness flickers open, and you've arrived. Congratulations, it's Victorian London. The very first thing that registers is not a sight, but an overpowering olfactory assault. The air itself possesses a thick, almost greasy quality that clings to the back of your throat, a miasma so potent it feels less like air and more like a substance you could chew. It is a horrifying symphony of smells, a grand unified theory of stench. Imagine the cloying odor of human waste mingling with the sour decay of rotting refuse, the acrid bite of coal, smoke from a million chimneys, and a deeply unsettling Swedish undertone of sickness and decomposition that you can't quite identify, but will never forget. This is your new atmosphere. As you make the slightest movement in your bed, assuming you're fortunate enough to have won the foreignness of this world, becomes even more intimate. The linens, if they can be called that, possess a coarse, abrasive texture against your skin, a world away from the soft spun cottons of your own time. They are scratchy, unforgiving, and they carry an odor all their own. A musty, lived-in scent that speaks of infrequent washing and confined spaces. Forget the fresh, clean fragrance of modern laundry. That technology is a distant dream. The good news is that you have woken up. The grim reality, however, is that the odds of you staying that way for long are distressingly slim, a fact you can feel in the very fibers of the bedsheets. The raw statistics of survival in this era paint a brutal picture, a lottery determined entirely by the circumstances of your birth. Here in a district like White-Capelle, a place teeming with the city's laboring poor. The average man can expect his life to be extinguished by the tender age of 22. A tradesman, perhaps a carpenter or a clerk, might fare slightly better, possibly reaching the age of 27. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, in a more affluent part of the city, a member of the gentry, a gentleman of leisure, could reasonably anticipate living to the ripe old age of 45. The stark disparity isn't just a matter of wealth, it's a chasm of 23 years, a lifetime of difference carved out by sanitation, nutrition, and class. If you are counted among the city's poor, which is the most probable scenario, your personal space has shrunk to almost nothing. You likely inhabit a single room, a cramped space perhaps 10 by 12 feet, which you share with a half-dozen other souls. These might be your kin, or they could just as easily be strangers, subletting a corner of the floor. The distinction hardly matters when privacy is a concept as foreign and unattainable as the moon. The walls perpetually weep with a damp chill, and in the corners, a strange, greenish-black fuzz flourishes, a silent, creeping resident that everyone tacitly agrees to ignore. The air is thick with the exhalations and odors of your many roommates, a shared atmosphere of survival. Now, let's imagine you've been luckier in life's lottery and belong to the emerging middle class. Your circumstances are certainly an improvement. You might have the distinct luxury of your own bedroom, possibly even a bed you don't have to share. Yet, the term better is entirely relative and must be graded on a steep curve. Your home, a source of great pride, is still fundamentally primitive by our standards. There is no magical tap from which water flows on command, no network of wires delivering light and power at the flick of a switch. And that private, pristine room we call a bathroom, with its flushing toilet and dedicated sink, that, my friend, is a piece of domestic technology that has yet to be conceived of, let alone installed. Herein lies a fascinating paradox. The people of this era, from the lowest laborer to the highest aristocrat, genuinely perceive themselves as clean individuals. They operate with a sincere conviction that they are upholding rigorous standards of personal hygiene. The chasm in understanding comes from their very definition of cleanliness, which is built upon a foundation of beliefs and knowledge so radically different from our own as to be almost unrecognizable. They followed their own complex rituals and routines, fully believing they were doing everything necessary to present a healthy and respectable front to the world. Their idea of good hygiene was simply not our idea. Consider that cherished modern ritual, the daily shower, that long, steaming, all-encompassing wash where you lather your hair and scrub your entire body clean. You must erase this image from your mind completely. It is not merely uncommon in the Victorian world. It is an idea that would be met with genuine alarm and disbelief. If you were to propose such a practice, immersing the entire body in water every single day, you wouldn't be seen as eccentric. You would likely be viewed as dangerously insane, a person actively courting illness, and perhaps even death through a bizarre and reckless daily ritual that flew in the face of all medical reason. The resistance to frequent bathing was not rooted in laziness or a lack of desire for cleanliness, but in firm medical doctrine. The prevailing wisdom of the time, championed by physicians, held that immersing the body in water too often was a perilous act. It was believed that excessive bathing would strip the body of its natural protective oils, leaving the constitution weakened and the pores wide open to invasion by disease-carrying miasmas or foul airs. A full bath was seen as a shock to the system, an activity that could easily lead to a debilitating sickness, or, in the worst cases, prove fatal. Water, to them, was not just a cleanser, it was a potent and potentially hazardous element. So, how did they manage to stay clean? They employed a meticulous system of localized washing, often referred to as a sponge bath or a dry wash. The principle was one of strategic maintenance rather than a full-body immersion. One would focus exclusively on the socially critical areas. This meant a thorough cleaning of the face and hands, the parts of you visible to the world, followed by a brisk wash of the armpits and the groin, the areas most prone to producing strong odors. Everything else, from your back to your legs to your feet, was deemed non-essential and could simply wait for that rare occasion of a full bath. It was a highly efficient, if incomplete, method of personal detailing. Let us paint a more detailed picture of this daily ritual. You would stand in your bedroom, as dedicated bathrooms are still a future fantasy. Beside you is a small wooden washstand, upon which sits a ceramic basin and a matching pitcher filled with water. This water is, of course, cold. The technology to have hot water readily available on an upper floor is a luxury reserved for the wealthiest estates, if it exists at all. You pour a small amount of the frigid water into the bowl, take up a rough cloth or a natural sponge, and begin the methodical process of spot cleaning your own body. It's a brisk, functional, and deeply uncomfortable way to start the day. The affluent, naturally, had more sophisticated arrangements. Some grand homes boasted magnificent copper bathtubs, which were a marvel of their time. However, even for the wealthy, a full bath was not a daily indulgence, but a weekly, or perhaps bi-weekly, event. The process was incredibly labor-intensive, requiring servants to haul buckets of water, heated over the kitchen, fire up multiple flights of stairs, and to conserve this precious resource. The same tub of water would serve the entire family in a strict hierarchical order. The patriarch would bathe first, followed by his wife, and then the children, descending from oldest to youngest. By the time the last child was submerged, the water was a tepid, murky soup of soap, dirt, and shared family grime. The perceived dangers associated with bathing were so widely accepted that they spawned a genre of instructional literature. Books and pamphlets were published to guide people on the proper and safe way to conduct a full-body wash, lest they inadvertently harm themselves. These manuals were filled with extraordinary rules. One might advise against washing your face while traveling for fear of impurities in the local water. Another might champion the Russian bath, a practice of alternating between scalding hot and freezing cold water on the face to supposedly prevent wrinkles. The very existence of these guides reveals a society where a seemingly simple act of hygiene was viewed as a complex and hazardous undertaking. Let's now turn our attention to oral hygiene, a subject of considerable discomfort. The toothbrush did exist, but it was a luxury item, far beyond the financial reach of the average person. Furthermore, these implements were not the gentle, nylon-bristled tools of today. They were constructed with handles of bone or wood and featured bristles made from stiff, coarse animal hair, often sourced from the back of a pig. Imagine attempting to clean your teeth with what was essentially a miniature version of a harsh scrub brush, an object that not only felt unpleasant in the mouth, but also cost as much as a family's weekly supply of groceries. For most, it was an unthinkable expense. In the absence of affordable toothbrushes, the general populace had to innovate. A common solution was the chew stick, a simple twig frayed at one end to create a fibrous brush. Others would create their own abrasive tooth powders from whatever was on hand, including common chalk, powdered charcoal from the heart, or even the pulverized bone of a cuttlefish. And if a tooth began to ache, the situation grew dire. Proper dentists were virtually non-existent. Your only recourse was a visit to the local barber or the village blacksmith. This was the same individual who shod horses, now approaching your mouth with a set of unsterilized tools, ready to perform a brutal, anesthetic-free extraction. Washing one's hair was an entirely different kind of adventure, a foray into kitchen chemistry. With no commercially produced shampoos available, women relied on the contents of their larders. A surprisingly common method was to crack fresh eggs directly onto the head, working the yolks through the strands of hair as a cleansing and conditioning agent before rinsing with pitchers of water. The resulting smell must have been distinctive. Other popular hair washing concoctions included diluted vinegar to add shine, strong black tea, rum, or water infused with rosemary. Essentially, any liquid in the kitchen that was thought to have some beneficial property was likely tried on someone's scalp at some point. This process of hair washing was undertaken with remarkable infrequency, perhaps once a month. If that, a woman's hair was often considered her crowning glory, and it was piled into elaborate, complex styles that were meant to last for days or even weeks on end. To maintain these styles and give the hair a healthy sheen, women would apply various oils and pomades, often made from animal fats. Over time, however, these organic compounds would oxidize and turn rancid. Consequently, a woman's beautifully coiffed hair, a symbol of her femininity and status, would often emit the unmistakably foul odor of spoiled fat, a hidden olfactory horror beneath a veneer of elegance. The task of doing laundry was nothing short of a Herculean ordeal. In a world without washing machines, every single item had to be laundered by hand, a process that could consume an entire day. Soap itself was a costly commodity, prompting widespread use of alternative cleaning agents. Stubborn oil stains were treated with powdered chalk, while blood or grass stains might be tackled with kerosene. Most astonishingly, the primary agent for bleaching white linens was often stale urine, collected and saved for its high ammonia content. While chemically effective, the practice meant that the very definition of clean clothes was intertwined with substances we now consider the epitome of filth. The sheer, backbreaking labor involved in a full day of laundry naturally meant that it was done as infrequently as possible. For most families, a weekly wash was the standard, but many poorer households would stretch it to 2 weeks or even a month. This had a direct impact on daily life. People simply did not change their clothes every day. An outfit was worn repeatedly for days or sometimes weeks at a time until it could no longer be considered presentable. That exquisite Victorian dress you picture in your mind's eye was, in reality, a textile archive, absorbing and trapping every particle of sweat, smoke, food, and filth it encountered. The concept of underwear, as we know, it was not universal. For the vast majority of the poor, it was a non-existent layer of clothing. The more affluent might possess linen undergarments, but even these were not changed with the daily frequency we would expect. Consider this in the context of women's fashion, which consisted of multiple, heavy layers of fabric. The corset, the chemise, the petticoats, all worn directly against the skin, all absorbing the body's oils and sweat, and all washed very infrequently. This layering of unwashed textiles, especially without the barrier of undergarments, created a personal atmosphere, trapping and concentrating body odor in a way that is difficult for us to imagine. To stroll down a London street during the summer months was to subject oneself to a full-scale sensory invasion. The air was a thick, nearly visible tapestry, woven from 1,000 foul threads. There was the intimate, musky scent of hundreds of unwashed human bodies, clad in their equally unwashed clothing. This was layered with the omnipresent haze of coal smoke from domestic hearths and industrial chimneys. Add to that the sharp, pungent odor of tons of horse manure baking on the cobblestones, and the faint, sweet smell of rot from the gutters. The resulting stench was not just a smell, it was a physical presence that followed you, a taste that coated your tongue. Let's establish the scale of the problem. By the mid-19th century, London was a sprawling metropolis, home to an astonishing 2.5 million souls. It was a city that had grown far too quickly, its ancient infrastructure completely buckling under the strain of the industrial age. There was no municipal system for garbage collection, no organized corps of street cleaners. The prevailing method of waste disposal was simply to open a window or a door and hurl your household refuse vegetable peelings, animal bones, old rags, and general filth out into the street. There it would join the ever-growing piles, left to fester, rot, and provide a magnificent feast for the city's thriving rat population. The disposal of human waste presented an even more acute and dangerous problem. The vast majority of homes were not equipped with any kind of toilet. Instead, daily life revolved around the use of the chamber pot, typically kept under the bed. Once used, its contents had to be dealt with. The most common solution was for a family member, usually a woman or a child, to carry the pot to the street and empty its contents directly into the gutter or onto the nearest refuse heap. For those on upper floors, a more expedient, though far more hazardous, method was to simply fling the contents out of the window, often with a cursory shout of warning to the pedestrians below. To manage the ever-filling cesspools, a special class of worker emerged from the shadows. The night soil men. Theirs was a profession so utterly repugnant that it was legally forbidden during daylight hours. Under the cover of darkness, this nocturnal guild would descend into the city's basements and backyards to perform the vital but loathsome task of emptying these pits of human refuse. They were, in essence, the secret sanitation department of a city, drowning in its own filth. In a final, disturbing twist of industrial logic, they would cart this raw sewage out to the countryside, where it was sold as a valuable fertilizer to farmers. This created a ghastly, closed-loop system where the waste of the city was used to grow the food that would be sold right back to its inhabitants. The city's reliance on horsepower created a secondary, relentless sanitation crisis, with a population of over 100,000 horses, pulling everything from private carriages to public omnibuses. The streets were under a constant, fragrant siege. Each animal contributed between 15 and 35 pounds of manure to the urban landscape daily, resulting in a staggering accumulation of over 1,000 tons every 24 hours. During dry spells, this layer of waste would bake in the sun, pulverizing into a fine, foul dust that was whipped up by the wind, coating buildings, clothing, and the lungs of every Londoner. When it rained, the streets dissolved into a treacherous, ankle-deep slurry of mud and excrement. The Victorians possessed a unifying, though entirely incorrect, theory to explain the rampant disease that plagued them: the doctrine of miasma. This theory proposed that illnesses like cholera and typhoid were not transmitted by microscopic organisms, but by bad air They believed that the foul stench, rising from decaying organic matter, from sewage, garbage, and the unwashed, was itself the agent of infection. This miasma was envisioned as an invisible, poisonous fog that could seep into homes and bodies, causing sickness and death. While their senses correctly linked bad smells with disease, they tragically mistook the symptom for the cause, leading their preventative efforts completely astray. Operating under the flawed logic of miasma theory, the Victorian approach to public and personal health was not one of elimination, but of aromatic camouflage. If bad smells caused disease, then surely good smells could prevent it. This led to a pervasive culture of scent masking. The wealthy would douse themselves and their homes in expensive perfumes and carry pomanders filled with fragrant herbs. The poor made do with cheaper colognes or bunches of flowers. The ultimate effect, however, was not a pleasant one. The attempt to blanket the thick, complex stench of an unsanitary city with heavy floral and musk fragrances created a new, nauseating hybrid, a sickly sweet cloud that did little to hide the decay underneath. The quest for feminine beauty in this era was fraught with hidden dangers, as the most popular cosmetics were often laden with poison. A pale, porcelain complexion was the height of fashion, a sign that a woman did not have to toil outdoors. To achieve this coveted look, many turned to products like Laird's Bloom of Youth. This face lotion promised a delicate, youthful pallor, but its primary ingredients were lead acetate and carbonate. With each application, women were unknowingly administering a dose of heavy metal poison, which would gradually build up in their systems, leading to a horrifying condition known as lead palsy, characterized by muscle atrophy and paralysis. They were literally sacrificing their health for a transient, toxic beauty. The desire to conceal the natural signs of aging extended to hair care, with similarly devastating consequences. Graying hair was a social liability, and products promising to restore youthful color were enormously popular. One leading brand, Hall's Hair Renewer, was a staple on many dressing tables. Its secret ingredient, however, was a significant quantity of lead. The daily ritual involved massaging this concoction directly into the scalp, allowing the poison to be absorbed through the skin. Users would then suffer from a host of mysterious ailments, chronic fatigue, tremors, confusion, all symptoms of lead poisoning. Yet they would never connect their failing health to their trusted bottle of hair renewer. The private beauty rituals of the era could be equally bizarre and unsanitary, lacking the sophisticated chemistry of modern skincare. Victorians relied on organic and often perishable remedies to achieve a youthful complexion. It was not uncommon for women to apply slices of raw beef to their faces before sleeping, believing the meat's juices could smooth wrinkles. Imagine the scent profile of a wealthy woman's bedchamber, the cloying sweetness of lead-based powders, the acrid notes from a mercury rouge, the rancid odor of the pomade in her unwashed hair, and, mingling with it all, the faint, decaying smell of the raw meat she had used as a face mask. It was a complex and deeply unpleasant personal atmosphere. Despite the primitive and often dangerous nature of their methods, it would be a mistake to view the Victorians as simply dirty. They were, in fact, incredibly resourceful, operating with a deep commitment to their own established standards of cleanliness and beauty. Within the severe constraints of their knowledge and technology, they developed intricate routines and demonstrated a remarkable adaptability. There's a certain grim impressiveness to their efforts. They were actively striving for a sense of dignity and order in a world that was overwhelmingly chaotic and filthy. And this resilience, this dedication to feeling clean on their own terms, is a core part of their story. The wealthy class outsourced the most unpleasant aspects of hygiene to a legion of servants. Maids were tasked with the grim duty of emptying chamber pots. Laundresses battled mountains of soiled clothing, and bath attendants hauled endless buckets of heated water. This created a profound irony. At the heart of the class system, the individuals responsible for maintaining the cleanliness of the elite were, by virtue of their labor and living conditions, often the most unhygienic people in the household. They spent their days immersed in the filth of their employers, only to return to their own crowded, unsanitary quarters with little time or energy for their own personal care. They were curators of a cleanliness they could not afford for themselves. For the vast majority of London's population, personal hygiene was a distant, almost frivolous concern. When your daily existence is a relentless battle for the most basic necessities, cleanliness becomes an unaffordable luxury. The primary focus was survival, securing enough work to earn a few shillings for rent, finding enough food to quell the gnawing hunger in your family's stomachs, and affording enough coal to keep the damp chill of a London winter at bay. After these all-consuming struggles, there was simply no energy, time, or money left for the abstract concept of hygiene. It was a problem you worried about only after you had solved all the others, which, for most people, was never. It is fascinating to imagine how a person from the 1850 would perceive our modern world. They would likely look upon our daily hygiene habits with a mixture of shock and genuine medical concern. The idea of a daily, full-body shower would strike them as a reckless and dangerous obsession. They would argue that we are stripping away our body's natural protective layers, leaving ourselves weak, effeminate, and dangerously susceptible to every passing illness. Our meticulously clean homes, scrubbed with chemical agents, would seem sterile and unnatural. In their view, we would be a fragile people, made vulnerable by an irrational fear of the very dirt from which we came. It is crucial to remember, amidst all this talk of filth and disease, that the Victorians were not a monolithic entity of dirty people. They were individuals, as complex and varied as we are today. They experienced the full spectrum of human emotion and activity. They navigated complex social relationships. They worried about their finances. They told jokes. They celebrated births. And they mourned deaths. The fundamental human experience was the same. The only significant difference was the sensory backdrop to their lives. They did all the things we do. They just did them while smelling considerably worse and being surrounded by a level of squalor we can barely comprehend. Let us now confront a topic that truly underscores the gulf between our world and theirs: the toilet. Take a moment to picture the modern bathroom, a private, sanitary space with clean, running water, soft paper, and a comfortable porcelain throne that whisks waste away with the simple press of a lever. It is a marvel of convenience and engineering that we use without a second thought. Now, hold that image in your mind and then allow it to shatter completely. For the vast majority of Victorians, such a room was the stuff of science fiction. Instead, they had a range of alternatives, each one more unpleasant than the last. If you were counted among the urban poor, your toilet was a communal outhouse, often referred to as a privy. This was typically a crude wooden shack built over a deep, open pit known as a cesspool, located in a shared courtyard. This single facility was often the only one available for hundreds of residents. One government report from the era documented a district where over 7,000 people shared just 33 privies. This meant constant, long queues, an overwhelming stench that would make your eyes water, and a complete and utter lack of privacy or sanitation. It was a daily exercise in public humiliation and a potent breeding ground for disease. The more affluent households boasted a seemingly advanced piece of technology. The indoor water closet, this early form of the toilet, offered the luxury of privacy, but it came with a terrifying secret. Lacking a connection to any kind of municipal sewer line, these devices flushed waste directly down a pipe and into a sealed cesspool constructed in the basement of the house. In essence, the wealthy were living directly on top of a personal, ever-growing reservoir of their own family's excrement. This pit would sit and ferment just below the floorboards, a silent, slumbering monster of filth that was an integral part of the home's architecture. When the basement cesspool inevitably became full, its contents would begin to seep upwards, a process that announced itself with a foul, pervasive stench that would permeate the entire house. This was the signal to summon the night soil men. The emptying of a domestic cesspool was a ghastly, invasive procedure. Under the cloak of darkness, a team of workers would enter the home, pry open the pit, and begin the arduous task of manually bucketing out the raw sewage. The operation would fill the house and the surrounding street with a smell so vile that neighbors would seal their windows and doors. Often in vain, it was a visceral reminder of the filth that lay just beneath the surface of civilized life. By the middle of the 19th century, London's traditional methods of waste management were failing on a catastrophic scale. The city was growing at a pace that was simply unsustainable, a living organism that was slowly choking on its own byproducts. The sheer volume of human and industrial waste produced by its 2.5 million inhabitants had overwhelmed the centuries-old system of cesspools and night soil collection. The city's circulatory system, its streets, and its rivers was hopelessly clogged. London had become a case study in what happens when a population boom collides with an infrastructure designed for a much smaller, pre-industrial world. With the cesspools overflowing and the streets running with filth, the River Thames became the city's de facto sewer. It was the ultimate destination for everything London wanted to get rid of: human waste from countless overflowing drains, chemical runoff from factories, and the rotting carcasses of animals from the city's slaughterhouses. In a stroke of horrific irony, this very same river was also the primary source of drinking water for a large portion of the population. The Thames thus possessed a dual, deadly identity. It was both the city's main artery and its colon. This created a perfect, self-perpetuating engine for the spread of waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid. The crisis was not a secret. The government, the scientific community, and indeed any citizen with a functioning nose knew that London was facing a sanitation catastrophe. Yet, progress was completely stalled by a state of institutional paralysis. A fierce debate raged between competing factions. Should they build more and bigger cesspools? Should they simply embrace the Thames as a sewer and hope for the best? Was the problem even solvable at all? This political infighting, combined with a lack of scientific consensus on the nature of disease and a deep-seated reluctance to fund a massive public works project, meant that for years nothing was done. Then came the summer of 1858. A brutal, unrelenting heat wave settled over the city, with temperatures soaring to levels London was unaccustomed to. Day after day of blazing sun and no rain caused the water level of the Thames to drop precipitously. As the river receded, it exposed vast, thick banks of raw sewage and industrial sludge that had been accumulating for decades on the riverbed. Under the relentless heat, this exposed filth began to bake, ferment, and decompose at an accelerated rate. The river, which had always smelled foul, began to exhale a breath of pure, concentrated pestilence, a stench of an entirely new magnitude. The press quickly coined a name for this environmental cataclysm. The Great Stink. The term perfectly captured the public's imagination and unified their disgust. It was no longer just a chronic, unpleasant background smell. It was a singular, historic event. Prominent figures like Charles Dickens wrote furiously about the state of the river, describing it as a deadly sewer. Scientists in rowboats would drop scraps of white paper into the water, only to watch them vanish instantly into the opaque brown soup. The naming of the crisis crystallized it as a national emergency, a tangible and unforgettable assault on the senses of the entire city. For years, the government had successfully ignored the pleas of reformers and the suffering of the city's poor. The Great Stink, however, was a profoundly democratic crisis. Its stench did not respect class boundaries. The Houses of Parliament, situated right on the riverbank, were engulfed by the foul air. The business of governing the British Empire ground to a halt as members of Parliament, gagging and clutching scented handkerchiefs to their faces, could no longer endure the conditions. They tried dousing the curtains in chloride of lime to neutralize the smell, but it was useless. It was only when the problem physically invaded their own halls of power that the political will to find a solution was finally born. Out of this crisis, a hero of civil engineering emerged, Joseph Bazalgette. He was given the monumental and seemingly impossible task of fixing London's sewage problem once and for all. He did not propose a mere patch or a minor upgrade to the existing, failing system. Instead, he presented a plan of breathtaking audacity and scale. He envisioned giving London an entirely new subterranean anatomy, a revolutionary network of sewers that would intercept every drop of the city's waste and render the old cesspools obsolete. It was a proposal to re-engineer the very foundations of the metropolis from the ground up. Bazalgette's master plan was a marvel of Victorian ingenuity. It called for the construction of 82 miles of massive, brick-lined main intercepting sewers running parallel to the Thames on both sides of the river. These great underground arteries were designed to connect with over 1,000 miles of smaller, local street sewers. The entire system was meticulously angled to use the power of gravity to channel the collected waste far to the east of the city. There, at massive pumping stations, the sewage would be lifted and discharged into the Thames on the outgoing tide, ensuring it was carried far out to sea and away from London's drinking water intakes. The execution of this plan was one of the greatest construction projects of the 19th century. It was an act of urban surgery on an unprecedented scale. Entire neighborhoods were demolished to make way for the new lines. London streets were torn asunder for years, creating a landscape of chaos, noise, and dust. An army of laborers, known as navvies, toiled deep underground, using over 318 million bricks and a revolutionary new material called Portland cement, which was prized for its strength and waterproof properties. They were implanting a new, life-saving organ system into the body of the city, a hidden network that would secure its future health. The construction of this subterranean network was a grueling, multi-year saga of immense financial investment and civic disruption. But when the final connections were made and the system roared to life, the result was nothing short of miraculous. The change was not gradual. It was immediate and absolute. Londoners awoke one day to find that the great stink, the oppressive, ever-present character in the story of their lives, had simply vanished. The air, for the first time in living memory, was merely air. It was a feat of engineering so effective that it felt like an act of collective sensory magic, a city-wide exorcism of a foul demon that had haunted it for centuries. Yet, this celebrated solution was not without its significant flaws. Bazalgette's system was a marvel of conveyance, not treatment. It masterfully collected the city's filth, only to displace the problem, dumping the raw, untreated sewage directly into the Thames, several miles downstream. This created new zones of pollution, effectively making the health of London a problem for the fishing villages and towns further down the river. Furthermore, the implementation of the new sewers reinforced the city's rigid class structure. The elegant squares and terraces of the wealthy were connected first, enjoying immediate relief, while the desperate, overcrowded slums had to wait years for their connection to a cleaner future. The impact of the new sewer system on public health was breathtaking and undeniable. It was as if a great plague had been lifted from the city. The terrifying, cyclical outbreaks of cholera that had once scythed through the population, claiming thousands of lives in a matter of weeks, began to recede into memory. Typhoid, another waterborne killer, saw its prevalence plummet. For the first time, London had a robust defense against the diseases that had defined its mortality for generations. This single, massive work of public infrastructure proved to be one of the most effective, life-saving interventions in human history, proving that the health of a population could be engineered. In an era that could design and build such a sophisticated sewer system, the absence of a simple, disposable product for personal cleansing is a striking paradox. Commercially produced toilet paper was not a feature of the Victorian home. This most basic of needs was met through improvisation and resourcefulness. Scraps of old newspaper, with their cheap, absorbent paper, were a common solution for the literate classes. In more rural settings, a dried corn cob served the purpose. For others, it was simply a collection of old rags, which had to be washed and reused. This detail reveals a world where the grandest public solutions existed alongside the most primitive of personal realities. The chain of infection was completed by an invisible culprit that no one yet understood. Germs, lacking a coherent theory of microbial transmission. The simple, life-saving act of washing one's hands after using the privy was not standard practice. A person could handle contaminated materials, visit the outhouse, and then sit down to prepare or eat a meal without ever making the connection between their own hands and the subsequent illness that might strike their family. This profound lack of knowledge about the unseen world of bacteria created 1,000 tiny pathways for disease to travel, rendering even the most well-meaning households vulnerable to infection. Of all the diseases that haunted Victorian London, cholera was the most feared. It was a phantom that moved with terrifying speed and brutality. An outbreak would begin with a few isolated cases, and within days, it would explode into an epidemic, sweeping through the poorest districts like a firestorm. It was a disease of shocking violence, reducing a healthy person to a desiccated corpse in less than a day. Families would be wiped out, and entire neighborhoods would be gripped by a collective terror. In the face of cholera's onslaught, the city was utterly helpless, its citizens left to pray and wonder who would be next to succumb to the Blue Death. The medical response to a cholera outbreak was a frantic but futile exercise based on the flawed miasma theory. Believing the disease was carried on foul air, doctors prescribed treatments aimed at purifying the atmosphere. They would order large bonfires of tar or sulfur to be lit in the streets, hoping the acrid smoke would drive away the pestilence. Patients were given massive doses of opium or brandy, not as a cure, but with the desperate hope that it might fortify their systems against the miasmic assault. These remedies did nothing to halt the progress of the disease, of course, serving only to add smoke and intoxication to the suffering of the afflicted. In the midst of the chaos and confusion of the 1854 outbreak, one physician, Dr. John Snow, pursued a revolutionary line of inquiry. He was a medical detective, walking the streets of the afflicted Soho district with a map and a notebook. He rejected the miasma theory and instead meticulously charted the location of every single death. His investigation revealed a terrifyingly clear pattern. The fatalities were all clustered around a single public water pump on Broad Street. He discovered that even victims who lived miles away had a fatal preference for this water, sending for it daily. He had found the killer, and it was not in the air. It was in the water. Armed with his map and damning evidence, John Snow presented his findings to the local authorities, persuading them to take the radical step of removing the handle from the Broad Street pump. Almost overnight, the cholera cases in the area stopped. He had proven, through methodical investigation and a successful real-world intervention, the waterborne nature of the disease. Yet, his groundbreaking discovery was met not with acclaim, but with skepticism and dismissal from the medical establishment. They clung stubbornly to their miasma theories, viewing Snow as a crank. It was a tragic triumph of dogma over data, a failure that cost countless lives. While Bazalgette's engineering had rerouted the city's physical waste, rerouting the ingrained habits of its population proved to be a far more difficult task. The sewers were a modern miracle, but the people were still creatures of pre-industrial habit. For generations, the default method for disposing of refuse had been to simply toss it out of the nearest window or door. It took the better part of a generation for these behaviors to change, for the public to fully grasp the concept that their individual actions were connected to a larger, invisible system of public health. The hardware had been installed, but the cultural software took much longer to update. London's journey from notorious filth to relative cleanliness was not an event, but a slow, arduous process of urban convalescence. The new sewer system was the critical first step, the foundational surgery that saved the patient's life. But the full recovery involved decades of further work, connecting the poorest neighborhoods, enforcing new public health regulations, and, most importantly, fostering a cultural shift in the population's understanding of sanitation. The city's transformation was an evolution, a gradual healing built upon the bedrock of Bazalgette's vision, demonstrating that the revival of a great metropolis is a multi-generational endeavor. We exist today within a cocoon of convenience, utterly dependent on a legacy we rarely acknowledge. When you turn on a tap, flush a toilet, or walk down a rain-swept street without fear of wading through filth, you are experiencing the triumph of the Victorian sanitarians. The vast, intricate network of pipes and tunnels that silently serves our modern cities is a direct inheritance from their desperate struggle against the great stink. This invisible infrastructure, born from a crisis of filth, is the unsung hero of modern urban life, a guardian of public health that we have the luxury of taking almost completely for granted. The very clothes on a Victorian's back were a statement about the environment they inhabit. The era's fashion was, in many ways, a sophisticated form of practical camouflage. The preference for dark, somber colors, blacks, deep browns, and navy blues was not merely a matter of dour aesthetic preference. These hues were incredibly practical, possessing the distinct advantage of hiding the inevitable soot, stains, and splashes of mud that were a daily feature of city life. Heavy, durable fabrics like wool were favored because they could withstand more wear and tear between the infrequent, laborious wash days. Fashion was a form of defense against a relentlessly dirty world. Specific articles of clothing were brilliantly adapted to the challenges of the urban landscape. A woman's long, voluminous skirt, for example, was more than just a statement of modesty. It functioned as a personal street sweeper, its hem collecting the dust and refuse of the pavement, while discreetly hiding her mud-splattered boots. Similarly, a gentleman's dark, woolen suit was the perfect attire for navigating the city. It could absorb a remarkable amount of coal dust and grime without looking overtly soiled. In this way, Victorian fashion allowed a person to traverse the filthy streets and still arrive at their destination, maintaining an illusion of respectability and cleanliness. We now turn to one of the most private and unrecorded struggles of the Victorian woman, the management of her monthly period. In an age utterly devoid of the disposable sanitary products that are a cornerstone of modern life, this fundamental biological process presented a significant and recurring challenge. It required a level of ingenuity, discretion, and sheer fortitude that is difficult to comprehend. With no industry to serve this universal need, every woman was left to devise her own solution, crafting a system from the limited materials available to her, and managing it in a culture of profound silence and shame around the topic. The nearly universal solution for managing menstruation was a system of reusable rags. These were typically strips of cloth torn from old, softened linen or cotton garments. They were folded into pads, held in place by sheer hope and awkward positioning, and then endured. The most difficult part of this system was the maintenance. The soiled rags had to be washed by hand, a laborious and private task. They would be rinsed in cold water, scrubbed with harsh soap, and then hung to dry somewhere out of sight, perhaps in a dark corner of the attic or behind the kitchen stove. It was a constant, hidden cycle of uncomfortable wear and unpleasant labor. The medical establishment's view of menstruation only compounded the physical discomfort with psychological distress. Doctors of the era did not see it as a normal biological function, but as a uniquely female malady, a sign of inherent weakness and instability. They linked it directly to hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for female emotional distress, and believed it rendered women temporarily irrational. Treatments for menstrual complaints could be bizarre and dangerous, ranging from forced bed rest to prescriptions of mercury or other poisons. A woman's natural cycle was pathologized, turning her into a patient for a condition that was simply part of being human. The late 19th century saw the invention of the first disposable menstrual products, but this was not the liberating moment one might imagine. These early pads were clumsy, incredibly bulky affairs, often attached to a cumbersome belt worn around the waist. More importantly, they were prohibitively expensive, marketed as a luxury medical item rather than a common necessity. For the vast majority of working class and even middle class women, they were completely unaffordable. As a result, the humble, reusable rag remained the standard for decades to come, and this supposed innovation did little to ease the practical burden for most. The practice of medicine in the Victorian era was a landscape of bold experimentation where sincere efforts to heal were often indistinguishable from acts of unintentional harm. The physician's cabinet was stocked with powerful substances, but his understanding of their effects was rudimentary at best. Every diagnosis was an educated guess, and every prescription was a gamble. The patient, desperate for relief, was placed in the precarious position of trusting a practitioner whose treatments could, with equal probability, either alleviate their symptoms or introduce a new, more terrifying ailment. It was an age of heroic, but often tragically misguided, medical intervention. A cornerstone of Victorian medical practice was the ancient tradition of bloodletting. The underlying theory held that most diseases were caused by an imbalance of the body's humors, often an excess of blood. The logical, though deeply flawed, solution was to remove some of this excess. This was accomplished by applying leeches to the skin, using a lancet to open a vein, or employing heated cups to create suction and draw blood to the surface. For nearly any complaint, from a fever to a headache, a good bleeding was prescribed. This practice routinely weakened already sick patients, draining them of their vitality in the very name of restoring their health. If there was one substance that could be called the wonder drug of the Victorian age, it was mercury. This toxic heavy metal was prescribed with astonishing frequency for an immense range of conditions. It was the primary treatment for syphilis, but it was also given for depression, constipation, and even to teething infants. Patients would dutifully take their blue pills unaware that they were slowly poisoning themselves. The insidious symptoms of mercury poisoning, tremors, memory loss, kidney failure, would then be diagnosed as a new illness for which the doctor might, tragically, prescribe even more mercury. It was a deadly, self-perpetuating cycle of iatrogenic disease. Opium was the other great panacea of the era, and its accessibility was terrifying. It was the key ingredient in hundreds of patent medicines, which were sold over the counter without any regulation. The most infamous of these was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed to exhausted mothers of fussy infants. Its formula was a potent combination of morphine and alcohol. A single spoonful could quiet a crying baby by drugging it into a stupor, and a slightly larger dose could easily prove fatal. The product's grim, unofficial nickname, the baby killer, was a testament to the thousands of infants who were accidentally and lethally overdosed by their loving but desperate parents. The unregulated flood of opium-based medicines created a vast, silent epidemic of addiction that permeated every level of Victorian society, from the wealthy lady using laudanum for her nerves to the factory worker taking it for chronic pain. Dependency was rampant. Yet, the concept of addiction as a medical condition did not exist. Instead, it was viewed as a profound moral failing, a weakness of character. This meant that countless individuals struggling with a powerful physical dependency were offered not treatment, but condemnation and shame, forcing their suffering deep into the shadows of private life. To face the surgeon's knife in the Victorian era was to confront the absolute limits of human endurance. before the widespread use of anesthesia. Surgery was a fully conscious experience of structured, methodical torture. The patient was held or strapped down by strong assistants, while the surgeon, armed with his gleaming instruments, worked with a frantic intensity. Speed was paramount. The goal was to complete the procedure before the patient died from shock or bled to death. The only comfort offered was a leather strap to bite down upon to stifle the screams. It was an option of last resort, a brutal ordeal one only submitted to when the alternative was certain death. Even if a patient possessed the incredible fortitude to survive the agony of the operation itself, they faced a second, more insidious killer. Infection. The operating theater was a realm of profound ignorance regarding sanitation. Surgeons would move between dissecting a corpse in the anatomy lab and performing surgery on a living patient without so much as washing their hands. Their instruments were wiped on a dirty apron, but never sterilized. This complete lack of sterile procedure meant that nearly every surgical wound became infected. The hospital, intended as a place of healing, was in fact the place where survival of an injury or operation became least likely. The state of dentistry was, if anything, even more barbaric than general medicine. For the vast majority of the population, dental care was a passive experience of enduring decay. People simply lived with chronic toothaches, the pain a constant, gnawing companion, until the offending tooth either rotted away completely or the agony became so all-consuming that it demanded action. When that threshold was crossed, treatment meant one thing: extraction. This violent procedure was carried out not by a trained professional, but by the local blacksmith or barber, who would employ a terrifying assortment of pliers and crude levers to wrench the tooth from the jaw, all without the mercy of anesthesia. Let us now venture into the Victorian kitchen, a place that would likely fill a modern food inspector with unparalleled dread. The very notion of eating in this era would become a source of profound anxiety, not because the cuisine was unappetizing, but because the risk of consuming something spoiled or contaminated was extraordinarily high. The concept of food hygiene was in its absolute infancy. In a world without reliable refrigeration or an understanding of microbiology, every meal was a gamble. The food on your plate could be a source of nourishment, or it could be a vector for a debilitating illness. This constant, invisible threat transformed the simple act of eating into a daily game of Russian roulette. The absence of refrigeration fundamentally dictated the Victorian diet. Food began to decay almost the moment it was procured. To combat this relentless process, people relied on aggressive preservation techniques. Meat was often entombed in vast quantities of salt, a process that desiccated it into a tough, leathery substance that bore little resemblance to fresh meat, but would last for months. Another common method was smoking, where cuts of meat were hung for weeks in smoke-filled huts. This imbued the meat with a heavy, carcinogenic film that arrested decay, but also stripped it of much of its nutritional value. These methods did not enhance food. They merely made it last, sacrificing flavor and health for longevity. Beyond the natural process of decay, a more sinister threat lurked in the Victorian food supply: deliberate adulteration. A groundbreaking series of investigative reports published in the medical journal The Lancet by physician Arthur Hill Hassall exposed the shocking scale of this fraud. Using a microscope, he analyzed everyday foodstuffs and found them to be rife with dangerous additives. Bread was often whitened with alum, a chemical that caused severe digestive issues. Bright red cayenne pepper was frequently bulked up with common brick dust and colored with toxic red lead, a substance also found in some cheeses, to give them a richer hue. Profit, it seemed, was a far higher priority than public health. Milk, a food staple particularly vital for children, was perhaps the most dangerous commodity of all. It was a common practice for unscrupulous vendors to increase their profits by diluting the milk with water. The water they used, however, was often drawn from the same contaminated sources, polluted wells, or the River Thames itself, that were known to carry cholera and typhoid. A mother, believing she was providing her infant with essential nourishment, could in fact be administering a dose of deadly pathogens. This tragic irony made contaminated milk a primary driver of the era's staggeringly high infant mortality rates. Even when the ingredients themselves were fresh, the process of preparing a meal was fraught with peril. The typical Victorian kitchen was a far cry from our modern, easily sanitized spaces. A general ignorance of what we now call cross-contamination was the norm. A cook might use a wooden cutting board to butcher a raw chicken, and then, without washing it, use the same surface to slice a loaf of bread. The knives themselves were rarely cleaned to a standard that would kill bacteria. This meant that even the most wholesome ingredients could be transformed into a source of potent food, poisoning through the simple, unhygienic act of their preparation. The environments in which people ate further compounded these risks. The industrial laborer, for example, would often consume their midday meal right on the factory floor. They would handle their food with hands covered in the soot and chemical residues of their work, eating amidst machinery that leaked oil and spewed noxious fumes. A coal miner might eat his lunch deep underground, his bread and cheese coated in the same black dust that was slowly destroying his lungs. The lack of a clean, separate space for eating meant that the very act of sustenance was intertwined with the toxic exposures of their labor, adding another layer of danger to every bite. For the city's poor, dietary choices were dictated not by preference, but by desperation. They subsisted on whatever was cheapest, which inevitably meant consuming the food that was on the verge of spoiling the meat that was beginning to turn, the vegetables that were bruised and wilting. There were entire markets dedicated to selling this second-hand, cast-off food. Street vendors would hawk meat pies made from unidentifiable scraps and sell milk that had been sitting in dirty containers in the sun for hours. For the hungry, the immediate risk of starvation always outweighed the potential future risk of getting sick from the only food they could afford. In a world where the water was often a vector for deadly disease, many people turned to alcohol as a safer alternative for hydration. This led to a culture where consuming fermented beverages was a normal part of daily life. Even for children, a typical breakfast might include small beer brew with a low alcohol content that was considered a safe and nourishing start to the day. Laborers would drink beer or ale throughout their shifts. This constant, low-level consumption meant that a significant portion of the population existed in a perpetual state of mild intoxication, a hazy state that perhaps made the harsh realities and foul smells of their daily existence slightly more bearable. For most of the Victorian era, the consumer was utterly unprotected. There were no government health inspectors, no regulations governing how food should be prepared or stored, and no legal standards for purity. The marketplace was a lawless frontier where the principle of caveat emptor buyer, beware reigned supreme. If a butcher wished to sell you rotting meat, or a baker wanted to mix chalk into his flour to stretch his profits, he was legally free to do so. The public's only defense was their own judgment, a poor shield against the sophisticated and often invisible fraud that was rampant in the food industry. A gradual shift in cultural attitudes toward hygiene began with two powerful forces, mass production and marketing. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, soap, once a harsh and expensive luxury, became cheaper to produce and gentler on the skin. Enterprising companies began to advertise their products not just as cleaners, but as keys to a better life. Lavish advertisements linked specific soap brands with beauty, social mobility, and health. This created a powerful new narrative that helped transform cleanliness from a simple chore into a desirable, aspirational social value, something one could purchase to improve one's standing in the world. The most significant turning point in the history of hygiene was the gradual, hard-won acceptance of germ theory, the revolutionary idea that invisible microorganisms, not bad air or moral failings, were the true cause of disease, fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with the world. This scientific breakthrough provided the logical foundation for all modern sanitation. Suddenly, hand-washing was not just a social nicety. It was a critical medical procedure. Cleaning a wound was no longer a matter of aesthetics. It was a life-saving act. This new knowledge empowered people with the understanding that they could actively fight back against the unseen agents of death. With the validation of germ theory, public institutions became the front lines in the new war against disease. Hospitals, once notorious death traps, began the slow process of transformation by implementing revolutionary practices like sterilizing surgical instruments and isolating patients with contagious illnesses. Schools also became crucial vectors for this new knowledge. They began to teach children the basic principles of hygiene, the importance of washing hands, brushing teeth, and general cleanliness. These children, in turn, would carry these life-saving lessons home, becoming miniature public health ambassadors within their own families. It's illuminating to contrast London's approach to urban renewal with that of contemporary Paris. Under Napoleon Roman III, Baron Haussmann undertook a radical and dramatic redevelopment of the French capital. He bulldozed vast, crowded medieval neighborhoods to carve out the wide, grand boulevards we know today. While this had a sanitary benefit, letting air and light into the city, its primary motivations were arguably political and military. The broad avenues were designed to prevent citizens from easily erecting barricades, as they had in previous revolutions, where London's solution was a feat of engineering hidden underground. Paris's was an aesthetic and authoritarian statement imposed upon the cityscape. Looking even further back in time reveals a humbling truth. The great Victorian engineers, for all their brilliance, or in many respects, simply reinventing technologies that had been perfected by the ancient Romans 2 millennia earlier. Rome had boasted a complex system of aqueducts, delivering fresh water, public baths for mass hygiene, and a massive sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, to carry waste away. This sophisticated understanding of public sanitation had been largely lost to Europe during the intervening centuries. The Victorians' heroic struggle against filth was, in essence, a monumental effort to climb back to a level of civic engineering that had been achieved long before. The crisis of the Great Stink served as the ultimate, undeniable vindication for the small, often ridiculed group of early sanitary reformers. For years, pioneers like Edwin Chadwick had been tirelessly campaigning, publishing detailed reports that explicitly linked disease to the filthy living conditions of the poor. His work was largely dismissed by a political establishment that preferred to blame the victims for their own illnesses. But when the stench of the Thames brought the government itself to a standstill, Chadwick's once radical ideas were suddenly revealed as prophetic truths. The crisis forced the nation to confront the connection it had long denied. That filth was the parent of disease. The successful completion of the sewer system had an impact that was far more profound than just clearing the air. It was a powerful psychological victory for the city. It demonstrated that a problem of seemingly insurmountable scale, a crisis that had defined life for generations, could be solved through human ingenuity and collective will. This triumph over filth sparked a new civic optimism. It fostered the belief that society did not have to passively accept its circumstances, that progress was possible, and that even the most daunting challenges of urban life could be overcome. This newfound hope fueled a much broader movement for social and environmental reform. Women were the often unsung heroes of this burgeoning public health movement. As the primary managers of the domestic sphere, they possessed an intimate, first-hand knowledge of the daily struggle against squalor and disease. They understood the grim reality of nursing sick children in damp, overcrowded rooms and trying to maintain a household in the face of impossible sanitary challenges. This lived experience made them incredibly powerful and passionate advocates for change. They formed committees, lobbied politicians, and campaigned tirelessly for better housing, cleaner water, and medical care, translating their domestic burdens into a powerful force for political reform. The story of the Victorian hygiene revolution is ultimately the story of the triumph of the scientific method in public life. The slow, painstaking process of observation, hypothesis, and experimentation gradually replaced centuries of superstition and dogma. The acceptance that disease was a biological phenomenon, not a divine punishment, was arguably the single most important intellectual shift in human history. It laid the groundwork for a world where people could expect to live longer, healthier lives, a world where the health of the public was seen as a solvable problem, not an immutable fate. This progress was not inevitable. It was earned through reason and research. Yet, amidst the pervasive filth and constant struggle, the human desire for dignity and beauty remained inextinguishable. A Victorian woman, despite her limited resources, would still spend hours preparing for a special occasion. She would carefully style her hair, put on her finest, most cherished dress, and feel a genuine sense of loveliness and pride. It's a powerful reminder that self-worth is not contingent on external circumstances. They found ways to create moments of grace and elegance in a world that offered them very little of either, demonstrating a profound resilience of the spirit in the face of overwhelming physical squalor. The gradual improvement of public health created a powerful, self-reinforcing cycle of progress. As people became healthier, they were less burdened by chronic illness and possessed more energy to advocate for better living conditions. As those conditions improved, their health became even more robust. This virtuous feedback loop was the engine that drove the dramatic social and environmental transformations of the late Victorian period. While the wealthy initially benefited most, the rising tide of sanitation and health eventually began to lift all boats, creating a society that was fundamentally healthier and more optimistic than it had been just a generation earlier. Take a moment to consider the quiet, mundane miracles of your modern life. The clean water that flows effortlessly from your tap, the fresh clothes you wear without a second thought, the simple confidence that the food you eat is safe. Each of these is a direct inheritance, a gift passed down from the struggles of the Victorian era. They are the hard-won victories of reformers who battled against filth, disease, and indifference. Our effortless comfort is built upon the foundation of their immense and often thankless labor. We live in the world they dreamed of, a world where basic sanitation is not a desperate struggle, but a silent, reliable fact of life. The individuals who championed these sanitary reforms were driven by a remarkable sense of foresight and altruism. Many of them, like Edwin Chadwick or the countless female activists, dedicated their lives to fighting for a future they would not live to see in its fullness. They labored in the very conditions of filth and disease they were trying to eradicate, motivated by the belief that their children and grandchildren deserved a better, healthier world. Their work was a profound act of faith in the future, a testament to the human capacity to work for the benefit of generations yet to come, even at great personal cost. As our story concludes, allow yourself to feel the profound contrast between their world and yours. Feel the weight of your body sinking into a clean, soft mattress. Breathe in the fresh, untainted air of your room. You are enveloped in a sphere of safety and comfort that would have been an unimaginable luxury to the people we've been discussing. Let this awareness deepen your relaxation. You are resting in the peaceful harbor that they fought so hard to build. Their struggle is over, and its legacy is your peace, your comfort, and your ability to rest without fear of the invisible dangers that once lurked in the water and the air. This peaceful, restorative sleep you are about to embrace is, in a very real sense, the ultimate inheritance of their efforts. It is a testament to the sewers built, the germs discovered, and the reforms enacted. As you drift off, let go of the day's concerns and sink into the deep comfort that their struggle made possible. You are the beneficiary of a long, hard-won battle for human dignity. Your body is safe, your home is clean, and your rest can be complete. Allow yourself to accept this gift of peace, to sink into the soft, quiet darkness, and to let your dreams be as gentle as your surroundings are safe. Sleep well.